Hello everyone, welcome to GGN. Today is Wednesday, December 12th, 2012, or 12/12/12, and I am Darko. My website is ggnonline.com, and on YouTube it's ddarko2012, and my backup is ddarko2013. Alright, I'm going to cover mostly geopolitics, what's going on in Syria, what's going on in Asia, and I'd like to cover so many more issues that's going on right now, but I'll do that tomorrow. Syrian rebels pledge allegiance to al-Qaeda-Linked group. The following U.S. decision to designate al-Nusra, a terrorist organization. Over 100 rebel groups pledge allegiance. So more than 100 Syrian opposition groups, including armed battalions and civilian committees, have signed a petition expressing solidarity with this terrorist group, al-Nusra, and denouncing the U.S. recent decision to officially designate the al-Qaeda-Linked group a terrorist organization. And in case you didn't know, there's just more proof, I guess. 99% of Syrian rebels are Islamic extremists and Jihadist terrorists. From December 10th, the lone Syrian rebel group, this is actually the CIA Times, Syrian rebels tied to al-Qaeda play a key role in war. So they're admitting that they are al-Qaeda-linked groups and that they're going to actually help get the regime change that they want. This lone Syrian rebel group with the explicit stamp of approval from al-Qaeda has become one of the uprising's most effective fighting forces, posing a stark challenge to the U.S. and other countries that want to support the rebels but not Islamic extremists. They go in there and talk about how the U.S. is indirectly funding and providing arms to Islamic extremists that are supposedly our enemy. Then an article from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, Mideast Folly, the U.S. arms find their way to Islamic extremists, from December 7th of this year. It says after denying the reality that the U.S. government is shipping arms, money, and foreign fighters with jihadist and sectarian worldview into Syria, the U.S. media is finally admitting the obvious to the American people. It says the first half truth is that the arming of the radical jihadist terrorists is not U.S. policy but accidental byproduct of outsourcing the war against Syria to the Gulf monarchies. So we're supposed to believe that the CIA was unaware that this would happen after their experience in Afghanistan and Libya. The truth is that the CIA is deliberately funding and arming jihadist terrorists to destabilize Syria and change its regime. It says here, regime change in Syria has been a U.S. aim since the false flag September 11th attacks by the Zionists, and going back further since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Syrians are not fighting their government, and Assad is not killing his own people. The picture the morally bankrupt mainstream media wants to paint is that the jihadists are scattered in otherwise noble, pure, and freedom-driven Syrian rebellion. You know, this is stemming from peaceful activists. They're saying that Washington wants to help the rebels but not the Islamic extremists, but there's no such thing as Syrian rebellion divorced from Islamic extremists. The Syrian rebels are in fact foreign-backed jihadist terrorists. So to support the rebels means to support jihadist terrorists. Al-Qaeda equals Syrian rebels, which most of you probably already know, but if you're new, or just happen to throw your TV out the window, then this information may be valuable to you. U.S. recognizes unelected terrorists as Syrian representatives. U.S. admits al-Qaeda among Syrian rebels and recognizes them as a legitimate representative of the Syrian people. Torrents of videos and confirmed reports documenting militant atrocities, including several involving the machine gunning of bound prisoners, and a particularly gruesome video just recently of a child handed a sword by militants to hack off the heads of bound men wearing civilian clothing. And it says here that it's becoming blatantly obvious, like we just said, that the Syrian opposition is in fact al-Qaeda. So what the U.S. is doing is they're openly saying that they represent al-Qaeda as the representatives in Syria. So Syrian al-Qaeda accused of involvement in North Lebanon fighting. The Free Syrian Army reportedly leading attacks on Tripoli's Alawites. It says fighters from a Sunni neighborhood are battling with the neighborhood of basically a majority of Alawites. But according to the head of Lebanon's largest Alawite party, many of the attackers coming from the Sunni neighborhoods aren't even residents in the first place, but instead members of the Free Syrian Army. That's why it's so crazy and ridiculous that after France and the UK recognize the Free Syrian Army or rebels as a legitimate representation of the Syrian people, is because most of these people are foreigners. They're not even Syrians. Then here in Damascus, explosion targets Syria's interior ministry in Damascus. It caused major damage to a building and killed or injured an undisclosed number of people. Live footage shows the blast site with pools of blood and piles of debris. Then we have up to 200 hurt in an attack on Syrian Alawite villages, says activists, so this is kind of what we were just talking about. But Reuters says it's unclear who's behind the assault. And then the second paragraph, other activists, like the peaceful activists, they have now turned to terrorists, foreign terrorists in Syria, blamed Assad's forces for the attack. So he's going to attack his own people. That sounds really intelligent, right? That's a good way to bolster support. Okay, I wasn't going to include this article, but I will now. Syrian authorities tightly restrict the activities of journalists, so it's unknown. It's interesting because there's actually a record number of reporters being jailed globally, says this committee to protect journalists. It says more journalists around the world are sitting in prisons than ever before. And, of course, they put Iran and China in there. It's interesting because they don't even mention the United States where people actually get abducted or harassed or blackmailed. They don't mention that at all. But they don't. One of the countries they don't mention is Turkey, who's actually the worst jailer of journalists, and they're the ones that are heading up this front with Syria and possibly Russia. For whatever it's worth, though, the Aleppo residents are fed up with Syria's rebellion. The commercial industrial hub is in ruins as the battles continue. The Syrian industrial capital of Aleppo is a site of an industry and commercial activity no longer. Some half a year later into the rebel siege on the city, which the rebels promised would be over in a matter of days, the city is now a patchwork of bombed neighborhoods and various factions, both rebel and regime, constantly testing one another's defenses. So not a big surprise, but the rebels promised to ensure basic life needs were met across the city while the fighting was ongoing back in July, about a quick victory. So this is what you call soft power, and the whole thing's about troops and stuff like that, massing on the borders. That's probably not going to happen. That's a fail-safe. They have everything ready as far as the West and the globalists go, but as of right now, like Iran and other countries, they use sanctions, crippling sanctions and stuff like that, and they actually just basically have the people suffer so that they can eventually lose support for whoever's in power, so they get the regime change. So no industry, no markets, and even the price of food is skyrocketing. So the U.S. knows that this is happening, and especially now in the winters, it's getting colder. The living conditions, especially in those refugee camps, which there are now 500,000 of them, are going to have a pretty rough and long winter. And the U.S., they don't care. See, they say the combatants don't care and the regime doesn't care. Well, the regime, like I said, they do have an interest. They have to, because if they don't, they lose support. And so the United States, though, they know that this is happening, and they're going to continue to do it. But they don't care either. Yeah, it's just crazy because they take it out on people who don't have any, they don't really have much of a say in what's going to happen there, just like in the United States. Syria fires Scud missiles at insurgents, the U.S. says, so I'm not sure if this is true because it's coming from the New York Times. But it says here they fired Scud missiles at the terrorist fighters in recent days. So everybody knows if Syria goes down, it's going to be a big domino effect, especially like Lebanon, because that's of course on Wesley Clark's list that he was talking about. This is all part of a plan to take down one country after another, including Iran. Though I'm not sure if that's actually going to happen. But it goes on, it says this conflict threatened to destabilize the Middle East. Well, the U.S. military says they're going to retain a strong presence in the Middle East, despite a strategic, economic, they're not going to say that, shift to Asia. So just like with Afghanistan and Iraq, I just covered about how there's actually thousands of troops going back to Iraq from Kuwait. Also, just still going to be mercenaries and troops and stuff like that in Afghanistan. They're not going anywhere. Whether these missiles were actually fired or not doesn't really matter. They're going on and linking them with Saddam Hussein and Soviet era, so that should scare you, right? But this builds the whole case for Mr. Assad may resort to the use of chemical weapons in the conflict because what they said, this is the first time that the Assad government has fired missiles at targets inside Syria. Targets. Kind of like they use the word civilians. Already more than 40,000 civilians have been killed. So, and the terrorists are involved in with that. But they don't like to cover all the civilians that are killed by the rebels. Many of them women and children, like these drone strikes from Afghanistan and Pakistan. The U.S. Army starts targeting children. Says no child left behind. American military starts assassinating young people. The Obama and American military label all young men between the ages of 15 and 35 who happen to be in a battle zone as suspected insurgents who they can target and kill. That's right. It says, remember they can call them militants. That's what they call them. So they like how they play that word game with the civilians, calling the terrorists civilians, and calling the civilians militants. In a despicable article in the Military Times, the U.S. military says that children are legitimate targets in the war in Afghanistan because sometimes the Taliban and other insurgents use kids. 3 killed in U.S. drone strike in Pakistan. 3 killed. Well, let's see. Officials in Pakistan said a suspected U.S. assassination, well, a suspected U.S. drone, they're the only ones in there that are doing it, has killed 3 militants. Okay, so they could have been 3 children near the Afghan border. But they can do anything, right? Because in the name of terrorism, they have to, they have to fight the terrorists. But it says here that the U.S. initiates terror to create terrorists to overthrow governments. Well, they've already overthrown the government. They got their nice little puppet there. But in order to maintain an actual physical presence, they have to create more terrorists like they created the Taliban to begin with. So there has to always be conflict so they can go in there and say, we're fighting the terrorists. No, they're actually creating the terrorists. I actually just covered an article where that, I think it was a report that was done that actually showed that the war on terror actually creates more terrorists. The Taliban popular where U.S. fought biggest battle. So this is supposed to be a propaganda piece from the AP. And it says, after U.S. occupation, angry residents say they're too afraid to go out after dark because of marauding bands of thieves. It goes on and says corrupt police and government officials, including Karzai, that they put in there, bully them into paying bribes. Kind of like the bribes that the U.S. pays Taliban not to attack their convoys, but they're not going to include that. After 11 years of war, many here long for a return of the Taliban. You say under the Taliban, who routinely punished thieves by cutting off their hands, they were at least safe from crime and corruption. The U.S. is providing training to the Syrian rebels in Jordan. The sources claim that the U.S. has been coordinating training sessions for the Syrian terrorists and the use of anti-aircraft weapons. Oh, they just were training them on how to, quote, handle chemical weapons, i.e. how to actually use it. And just like after the elections, Britain is back in the game. Britain takes the lead in talks over arming the Syrian terrorists. They have taken the lead in intensifying international discussions about aiding and arming these terrorists who are due to announce the creation of a military command designed to unify the terrorist ranks fighting Bashar al-Assad's government. Remember we were talking about how Germany, all of a sudden, sending Patriot missiles, now sending troops. Well, the Germans are fretting about troops on the Turkish border. They say defense missiles will help Turkey defend itself from Syrian attack. Like one viewer pointed out, it's actually for Russia. I think that might be true. Yet Germans worry about the potential for escalation, as well as the security of their 400 troops on the ground. Pretty interesting, though. It says Turkey's under threat. Turkey is one of the most militarized nations in that area. It's a NATO country. I don't think they have anything to be worried about. And Britain's Cameron tells Zionist fundraisers he will stand by the Israeli regime. He's committed to the regime in a speech, he said, at Conservative Friends of Israel, a radical pro-Israeli group within the UK establishment. The Zionist said, I am not an acquaintance of Israel. I'm not a colleague of Israel. I'm a passionate friend of Israel, and that is how it always will stay. And it's kind of like his confidant in Canada who received the Jewish award. It says here, U.S. dutifully offers to replace Israeli munitions spent on Gaza. The U.S. to sell Israel $647 million worth of bombs and munitions to renew stock after Operation Pillar of Defense. Some of them even include 3,400 pound bunker busters. It says here in the recent attack on Gaza, there was 900 mostly civilians, compared with 6 Israelis killed. But hey, remember when Brzezinski said U.S. won't follow Israel like a stupid mule from November 29th? Brzezinski does not think there is any implicit obligation for the U.S. to follow like a stupid mule whatever the Israelis do. Israeli Foreign Minister vows full occupation of Gaza for any future rocket firing. So, like they had a ceasefire before, they'll basically, like I said, assassinate one of their leaders, the Hamas leaders, and then they'll carry out the show, saying if they want war, they'll get war. And remember, talking about civilians, they called it what? Trimming the grass, basically, the blades of grass. They're talking about basically calling the Palestinian people off. So they have to have these little hot wars every once in a while to kill some people. And Palestinians were actually going to take their little case there in the International Criminal Court against Israel, but I'm not sure how much is going to happen. Along with the EU's threats against Israel, nothing really ever happens after this stuff. they're never really held accountable. Lieberman also condemned Israeli soldiers who followed the military's order not to open fire on Palestinian protesters, saying it was unacceptable for the soldiers to withdraw from protests instead of attacking the demonstrators. This is GGN, and I'm Darko. Thank you.